Um, Alright, welcome back to the Quagmire. Today we have a Marxist YouTuber by the name of TheFinnishBolshevik. Introduce yourself.
Hello everybody. Yeah, I have a YouTube channel. I talk about all things related to Marxism, really, history of the working class movement, Marxist theory, philosophy, all that stuff.
I mean,
Is your so
carry on.
is your specific interest in Soviet Russia, or do you cover other communist countries?
Yes. Well, the Soviet Union is so important, I would say, to the history of the communist movement that, yeah, kind of inevitably it is that, but also the Finnish communist movement as well. I kind of have in terms of like people online, I sort of am in a unique or almost kind of unique position in the sense that I speak Finnish, I read Finnish, so um I have the ability to like give people information about the Finnish communist movement, while obviously people from other countries wouldn't really have access to like Finnish language sources and stuff like that.
Could you give us an overview of the history of Finnish communism? Because I don't think that many people would know a lot about that.
Well, people some people might know that Finland had a socialist revolution in 1918, soon after the October Revolution in Russia. But usually that's about it. And also people know that Finland had a war with the Soviet Union. But okay, so if I give a brief overview, well, in the early 1900s, the Social Democrat Party was founded in Finland, and that was like the only workers' party. The 1905 revolution in Russia, so the failed revolution, which originally attempted to overthrow the Tsar, that also spread here, and it was very influential here. Then in 1917, when the Tsar was overthrown, that obviously had a big impact on this country as well. The class struggle, I guess, intensified, and you could say that there was a real revolutionary situation here. So after, especially after the Bolshevik Revolution, things just got, there was a real like power vacuum in this country. And basically when the Tsarist authority ceased to exist, the Finnish capitalists started to quickly arm themselves because they realized they need their own sort of repressive military force now. And as a self-defense, the workers started to create their own Red Guards, and eventually it escalated to like a full-blown civil war between the White Guards and the Red Guards. The revolution failed mainly because the Finnish party was not a truly communist party yet, so they didn't really know what they were doing. And also because Germany invaded in 1918. That led to a couple decades of basically semi-dictatorship. Leftists were persecuted and stuff like that. That really only ended after the Second World War, because Finland joined the Axis, Finland joined Operation Barbarossa, but um, when fascism was defeated, Finland also had to take like a different path and kind of become a more democratic country, and that started a new era in the workers' movement as well. And then we had a pretty successful workers' movement until, I would say, the collapse of the Soviet Union. That's when the workers' movement here went into a big crisis.
Is your workers' movement, is it more of like, a Marxist Leninist like workers' movement, or is it like a Trotskyist like workers' movement? What kind of alignment does the workers' movement have politically?
Well, these days, everything is controlled by social democrats. So it's all very reformist, but historically, ever since the revolution, really, the revolution was a big split. That's when people they chose either reform or revolution, and ever since then it was split into those two basic factions. So you could say half of the workers' movement was communist in the Marxist Leninist tradition, and half of it was reformist or social democrat. Uh, Trotskyism has always been pretty marginal here.
Mhm.
It's interesting that Finland and like the entirety of Scandinavia is often held up as one of the best places in the world to live. And it's like almost like a shining example of like the best part of the current paradigm. And so like if you're proposing, obviously that you would propose that Finland should be reformed, but isn't there a contradiction there about like how uh, do you know what I mean? Like how Scandinavia is often like shown as is that true that like we often think of Scandinavia as like such a great place and an example of what capitalism and liberal kind of democracy can achieve?
Yeah, that is what people always say, and it tends to be, especially in America, people say like Finland is like the utopia or Sweden is the utopia that they want. But um, well, this like so-called welfare state or whatever that didn't exist until after the Second World War. So before that, Finland was like a semi-fascist, almost a fascist dictatorship, even though people don't really like to admit that. Finland was a little bit of a different kind of fascism because it was very low key. Like people were persecuted all the time, but they still kept this facade of parliamentarism. But um, really, it's a much more complicated story. Like when fascism was defeated, that is when, as a result of the left and the workers' movement, we had all these great reforms like um, like what do you call it? Like benefits for parents with children and universal health care and pensions and paid vacations and all these were things that the communists basically achieved while the right wing was resisting tooth and nail. And now, of course, the right wing wants to take credit for all that. They say like, oh yeah, we just gave people all those things because of the goodness of our hearts, which is completely false. And even so, the Finnish welfare state, it kind of reached its peak maybe in the 70s or 80s. After that, we've kind of gone into neoliberalism, and now everything is being privatized and defunded, and there's cuts and austerity and stuff like that. So these days, like we have a social democrat government currently, but they don't really talk about how they're going to improve people's living standards or improve the services. They're always just talking how they're going to save money and how it's not a matter of if things are going to be privatized and if things are going to be cut, but it's a matter of how much and how quickly. So that's the whole debate right now.
Hmm.
So yes, the situation is, I would say, is better than in the US or in some other places, but it's been getting worse for a long time, and there doesn't seem to be any change in that. It's basically the so-called welfare state paradise utopia. It seems like it's going to go away.
I mean, furthermore, aren't there arguments like within Marxist texts that argue that the whole concept of the welfare state within capitalism is a means to push back its inevitable collapse?
Yes, there's disagreements about that, of course, because well, on the one hand, obviously, if the workers receive a bigger share of the value they create, so let's say we increase taxes on the capitalists and use that tax money to give people healthcare. Of course, that potentially can limit the profits of the capitalists, which is going to make capitalism collapse sooner because it becomes harder and harder for capitalists to get profits. But at the same time, it can also be a way to pacify and bribe the population into not fighting for their rights. If we, that's so it's a complicated thing. Sometimes the ruling class might want to give people certain concessions if that way they can avoid a revolution or avoid the people getting any more rights for themselves.
Like, what's your personal stance on it?
Well, you just have to. This is maybe a sort of a cop-out answer, but you kind of have to just analyze the situation very carefully and see. But I guess the rule of thumb is that communists have never really fought to make people's conditions worse. So it doesn't make sense to oppose, like we should never support cuts or privatizations, and we should never advocate for making conditions worse. So if the workers are fighting for their rights, if they're fighting for improvement in their conditions, we should almost always we should support them unless there's some kind of really weird situation.
So what you're saying about the it depends on the situation, that's a hallmark of scientific socialism. What would you say is the difference between utopian and scientific socialism?
Yeah, I guess you could say that, although utopianism is I would say the difference between scientific socialism or Marxism is called scientific socialism. The difference between that and utopian socialism is that utopianism is usually based more on sort of ethical principles, maybe can be based on religion. It can be based on just sort of outrage at the injustice of the world and at the suffering of the world. And, of course, Marxism recognizes that capitalism is bad and causes suffering, but it's not enough to just recognize that that war is bad and people dying and people suffering is bad. We also have to understand why it's happening and how it's happening and what actually can be done to change it.
So it's kind of like taking a more, I don't know, analytical approach to the situation. Like, yes, this is bad. Yes, this may make your heart bleed or whatever, but at the same time, you kind of have to take a more detached, analytical approach. You have to look at the situation objectively.
Yeah, totally.
Is that like, would you say that's the basis for your thought overall?
Yeah, of course, analyzing the situation is always pretty difficult, I would say. It would be so easy if we could just read books and then the books would have all the answers and like, oh yeah, this is what it says in the book, so let's do that. But it's never really that easy. But that's really what we should do. And it would be naive to think that there's just some kind of universal easy fix for everything. That's not the case.
Like I had a question about like obviously Marx wrote a long time ago, over 100 years ago, and he was writing in a different kind of social situation than we're in now. Like times have changed. Do you think that communism needs to be updated for our age?
Well, yes, but in one sense, it always it's part of the nature of communism. If we say that Marxism is scientific, then of course we have to recognize that science needs to evolve. Otherwise, if science doesn't develop, it's not really science anymore. So it's in the definition of it. Marxism Leninism is considered to be the modern form of Marxism. There are, of course, people who call themselves orthodox Marxists who say that no, we want to stick to the old Marx. We don't accept Lenin. But as a Marxist Leninist, I would say that those people are supporting something that's outdated. but Marxism is not really a collection of positions or a collection of dogmas that you say like, okay, this is what Marxism is. It's more a methodology, and it's more of an analysis. So the core of Marxism can really be used. The same methodology could be used 100 years ago, and it can be used now. The situation is different, so how we use it is going to be different.
Because like obviously for Marx, like the center of power was the factories, and so like the revolution would be a lot more physical, like actually physically storming the factories. But nowadays the factories are not really in our countries anymore. They're in China and these countries where the capitalists can pay lower wages. And so like, do you think that the form of the revolution would have to be a lot different? Like, maybe we would have to claim websites or something. Like how would that be different, like the form of the revolution?
Well, that's something that Lenin talks about, how in the modern era, we basically capitalism has reached its highest stage, which Lenin calls imperialism. It's basically global capitalism controlled by these huge multinational mega corporations and banks. And he talks about something called uneven development of capitalism, which means that some countries are much more wealthy and much more advanced than other countries, because basically the rich countries exploit the poorer countries. So it leads into these weird differences between where different countries are at. So it might be realistic to say that the front line of revolution has shifted to the poor countries instead of Western countries. Let's say, like, if the next wave of revolution began in India or Africa, it wouldn't really surprise me, instead of, let's say, it happening in Sweden or the UK or something. But it's still going to be a physical revolution. We still need to, it comes down to overthrowing the state power and setting up a new workers' state power.
I was about to say about the concept of the state and stuff. One popular like socialist school of thought in the UK and stuff is anarchism. How would you go about, like, 'cause I know you're not an anarchist, like how would you go about refuting anarchism and stuff, or converting people from anarchism to Marxism?
Well, anarchism is very broad. Just like Marxism, there's many different kinds of anarchists, and I sympathize with them, but at the same time, the main gripe between anarchism and Marxism is obviously about the state. And anarchism, the point of anarchism is that they want to abolish the state right away. But to me, as a Marxist, that doesn't make any sense, because the state is an instrument that the ruling class uses to stay in power, whatever the ruling class is, whether it is a feudal aristocracy or industrial capitalists or workers. They all need some kind of instrument to stay in power. And as long as classes exist, and as long as class struggle exists, there is going to be some ruling class, and all the ruling classes always have a state. You can try to abolish the state, but I mean, what happens? Somebody else is gonna, like, what is a state? A state, anarchists often define the state as a monopoly on violence. So if you have all the guns, you are the state. So it's every time anarchists have tried to abolish the state, they have abolished the state in name only, because sure, they can say we don't have a state, but if they still have a bunch of people going around with guns defending themselves from enemies, that's still a state.
So people like the CNT and stuff and Free Territory, they were actually just states and stuff.
Yeah, as weird as that sounds, they had all the hallmarks of a state. If we look at like the CNT in Spain, they I mean they had their own army, which wasn't even a volunteer army, it was a army which conscripted people. So they told people like, yep, you are forced to join our army. And there were fascists running around, and the CNT would kill them, and or put them in prison. And they had ministers and courts and police, and like these are, what is this if it's not a state? Like they said it's a trade union, okay, sure, but this is a, at this point it's gone way beyond the functions of a usual trade union.
How do you prevent, like when you take power, not you specifically, but when the communists take power, how do you prevent like corruption and stuff setting in? Because I saw on your channel that you had a video about, and obviously you are focused very much on the Soviet Union, and like the Soviet Union did some things right, but obviously like there were like some deaths and some and gulags and stuff. And like, what's your opinion on like on how to remain, not be corrupted by power when you get it, kind of thing?
Well, I don't think that there is any simple solution like, oh yeah, if we had only thought of this one thing, then there wouldn't be any corruption. Like, no, it's not as simple as that. It's a matter of changing the whole material conditions and the whole culture. In the case of Russia, it started from a semi-feudal country, so most of the people were illiterate, they couldn't read. They were used to brutality, they were superstitious, they were in very violent circumstances, and they were surrounded by enemies. So that's going to create a type of government which is, always worried about enemies, sometimes relies on force, and stuff like that. Over time, it's possible to reform it. And when it comes to corruption in the sense of like monetary corruption, like bribes and stuff, if everything in the society is very scarce because it's a poor country like Russia was, and many like third world countries, they're poor, in those conditions it's easy to bribe people. But I think as the material conditions in the country improve and living standards improve and educational standards improve, we can start to minimize that more and more.
It just seems like that just seems like a concern for me about communism, in that like when the communists do take power, it seems like there's like an inevitable tendency for power to accumulate in the hands of a few people like Stalin and his kind of friends and stuff. Like there does seem to still be that tendency for power to kind of center around like a very small elite.
Yes, in some senses, yes, but what should I say to that? It depends what you mean by power. In capitalism, power is when certain people are billionaires and trillionaires. They have more money than small countries. They own more stuff than 90% of the population. In the Soviet Union, that wasn't really the case. But in the sense that there is, the top ministers or whatever who decide foreign policy or something. Yeah, in that sense, it was in the hands of a small number of people.
I was about to say, if let's say Soviet Russia had continued with a Marxist, like, line and stuff after Stalin died, do you think they could have changed for the better in that manner?
Yeah, completely. Yeah, people often say that, yeah, Stalin was the last like good Soviet leader, and after that you had a bunch of bureaucrats who didn't understand anything about Marxism and blah blah blah. But the problem really already started with Stalin. The system that was created under Stalin was obviously imperfect, and it was flawed to a big enough degree that once he once he died, and he was really a figurehead. He was the figurehead of world communism. But once he died and he was taken out of the picture, then the whole movement became confused and started going into a weird direction. But it can be already traced back to him. But I don't think anything is inevitable. I don't think that the whole thing was doomed from the get-go. They could have like really the problem with the Soviet Union is that they were the first country to try to do this. So it was kind of a process of trial and error. They were exploring something that was never done before. Obviously now we can learn from their mistakes, but they didn't have that luxury at the time.
I know, I feel like it's one of the misconceptions people have about Marxism and revolution in general. Like, it's not always going to work because it's about trial and error. We're moving on to a whole new stage of production and stuff. Like, it's got to have like at least some failures. There's got to be some fumbles along the way. Would you agree?
Yeah, obviously, the first workers' revolution was the Paris Commune in the 1870s, and that lasted only mere months, and then it failed, and it was only in one city. The next wave of revolutions, you had the Finnish Revolution and the Hungarian Revolution and the German Revolution and the Russian one. The Russian one was the only one that survived, but that already, it was clearly a sign that there was development. And after that, other countries joined, and soon there was a whole world socialist camp of countries. I think next time it's going to be finally communism is going to globally take over. But even capitalism, every new historical stage, even capitalism, when it was first tried and when the first bourgeois revolutions happened, they failed. There was an attempt, obviously, by Cromwell to already set up a bourgeois kind of regime. The German Revolution initially failed. The French Revolution, even though it succeeded, it was soon taken over by very conservative forces, and it reinstituted the absolute monarchy and all that stuff. So every new stage is always gonna be they're gonna have failures and then successes. And even though the Soviet Union eventually failed, it still had big achievements. So we shouldn't think that it was all just all for nothing and all just a failure.
I was about to say though, I don't want to. Yeah, if you had to, like, let's say you see a revolution that's happened in the past 100 years and stuff. If you had to have, like, like, which one would be your ideal revolution out of all the revolutions that happened? Which revolution would you say kind of did it the best?
Well, the Soviet one, obviously, it was successful. I kind of, I look back on the Finnish Revolution and I always think like, man, if they had done things differently, they could have like succeeded, because when it failed, it was pretty bad when the Germans invaded and the whites started putting people in concentration camps and everything. That could have been, people always say that it was wrong to even fight. They should have just surrendered right away, but that's not the case. They should have just, instead, the communist slogan was always, it's not wrong to fight, you just have to fight better. And if they had known how to fight better, then that would have been nice. But, hindsight and everything, so.
Are there any examples of communist movements happening now that are exemplary that you know of?
Well, that's a tough question. The European parties are all in how should I say? I wouldn't say the European parties are in a bad state, but they're in early stages of rebuilding themselves. The Greek Communist Party is the biggest one. but I don't. But if they, if somebody were to say that the Greeks are going to be the next ones to do a revolution or something, I would be a little skeptical. Sure, it's possible, but who knows? In India, Marxism is pretty big. So maybe I would say India, but in India there's so many different Marxist tendencies that I'm not so sure, and I'm also not an expert on India.
What's your opinion on communism in China?
Well, yeah, if you can call it communism. I'm open if somebody were to prove to me that China truly is a socialist country with a genuine communist party. I'm open to the possibility, but I'm very skeptical of it. It doesn't look like a socialist society. It doesn't look like a communist party. It looks to me like a capitalist country.
It's almost like China's like communist past and communist tendencies have allowed it to like do capitalism even better, kind of thing. Like it seems to be some kind of weird like mutant capitalist communist hybrid almost.
Yeah. Well, there's not really anything communist about it except maybe the slogans and the red flags and stuff. But economically speaking, it's very much capitalist. There's even capitalists in the party. They allow anybody to join the party now, not only workers and peasants and people who aren't capitalists. And it all dates back from like when Mao Zedong died. Um, his opponents, the right-wing faction of the party led by Deng Xiaoping, they took power, and modern China is the result of that. That's when they started to privatize the economy.
I was about to say about China and stuff. It seems a lot of the like Dengists or like pro-China, quote unquote communists, they're trying to cling on to something that resembled a communist state in the past and stuff. They're trying to cling on to the last bastion of hope for revolution. Would you say that's a problem within the Marxist movement?
Yeah, it's hard to say exactly why people support, Dengism or socialism with Chinese characteristics, as they call it. I'm obviously not a mind reader, so I don't know why exactly, but it feels like they support it because they just want to believe in some kind of big socialist power. But yeah, some of those people are all right. They're not all idiots or anything. It's just that it becomes a problem if you start to forget what Marxism even is, or if what Marxism is even about. If they can't even define what socialism is anymore. If they say, oh well, socialism can have private property, and socialism can have market economy, and socialism can have a party that has capitalists in it, then it starts to be like, well, what even is socialism at this point? At that point, it starts to become a problem.
Like, I'll say for many of the people watching, they might not know the distinction between personal and private property. How would you, distinguish between the two for the uninitiated?
Yeah, important question. Personal property is all your personal belongings. So there's this misconception that communism wants to ban people from owning anything, which is not the case. Your clothes, your video game consoles, your guitar, whatever, all that stuff, that's personal property. Those are just your things. Nobody is going to take those away from you. There wouldn't be any point. But private property in the Marxist sense or in the economic sense is basically means of production. So those are things that are used to produce and distribute products and goods. So stuff like farmland and factories and workshops, basically companies. Companies are private property. So the point of communism is to abolish the private ownership of means of productions, private ownership of companies and banks and infrastructure and all those types of things.
And give them to the workers.
yes, in the sense that to the workers, but really to society as a whole. Obviously, in communism, there's not going to be any classes anymore, so everybody's just going to be a worker. But yeah, sometimes
So
there's a misconception. Like some people think, well, how come the state nationalizes it? Why don't they just distribute it all to random people? But yeah, the point is that it should belong to society.
so it belongs to the. So what's your opinion on like worker co-ops, where the ownership of a company is equally distributed between the workers?
Well,
Of that
there's
specific place?
obviously there's many different kinds of co-ops. I think the textbook answer is that according to Marxist theory, that the role of co-ops, because co-ops are usually pretty small businesses which are owned by the people who work in them. The role of co-ops in an economy is usually defined by the rest of the economy. So in a capitalist economy, co-ops tend to be capitalistic, but in a socialist economy, co-ops can be socialist. So the problem from a Marxist point of view with a co-op is that the co-op doesn't belong to everybody. It only belongs to a small group of people. It belongs to the people who work in it. It can be 10 people, it can be 100 people, it can be 200 people, but it still doesn't belong to everybody. So that can be a very good thing, a very positive thing, but it's still not the end goal. In the Soviet Union, for instance, when agriculture was collectivized, they turned small private farm plots into collective farms. So you could have 100 families who all work in a collective farm, and 100 families own the collective farm together. But that was never the end goal. The end goal is that it belongs to the whole of society, not just to those 100 families, for instance.
It just seems to me like that kind of thing where you say that it belongs to everybody. It seems a little bit kind of faceless and impersonal, in the same way that like someone that works for a big multinational corporation are kind of alienated because they're serving this kind of overlord, which is kind of beyond them, and which they have no personal relationship with. And the idea of working on a farm that's owned by everybody, it still seems a little impersonal. Whereas for me, the idea of a co-op owned by the workers seems a little bit more personal and kind of, I don't know, wholesome, maybe.
Less alienating.
Maybe, but if I go to a factory and I think this factory belongs to everybody, which includes me, I don't see how that's worse than thinking this factory belongs to me and 50 other people. But really, it just comes down to the fact that the point of communism is not to split people into these small units where, okay, these 100 people own this, these 50 people own this, and these 10 people own this. Because let's say 50 people set up a co-op on a piece of land, and their land is very good. Let's say another 50 people set up another co-op on a different piece of land which isn't as good. The people on the better land are going to be richer. These other people are going to be poorer. If you don't take any kind of action to try to gradually equalize that, there's going to be a stratification where you have poor people and you have rich people, and the rich people are eventually going to accumulate wealth, and they're going to start to hire and exploit these poor people. And it gets even worse if you have some kind of like markets involved where this is something that anarchists sometimes say, is that we should just split people into these communes. Like each town is like a commune, and then every commune does whatever they want, and they just trade with each other. But that's very quickly going to just restore full-on capitalism, because some towns are going to be rich, some towns are going to be poor, and if they trade with each other, that's soon going to be unequal and exploitative, and especially if they don't coordinate with each other by any kind of, like, let's say, a national, like, state economic plan, then yeah, it's just not gonna result in communism at all.
It seems like the main difference between communism and anarchism is like anarchists have like a distaste for centralized power, whereas communists are kind of comfortable with that, with the idea of centralizing power.
Yeah, I'm sure that's a big part of it. Although, like, I guess it comes down to sometimes a psychological difference. Anarchists, there may be very scared of centralized power, whereas I'm more scared of chaos and restoration of private ownership, and not so much of unity and strict organizations and stuff like that. But you can always go too far in both directions. You can have too much decentralization. You can have too much centralization. In socialism and communism, really, you should come up with the right kind of compromise between local autonomy and nationwide planning, because it really takes both. If the local people don't have any say, then the planners, the central planners or whatever, they're not going to know what to do. They need the local people to help them and to give them feedback and also to implement the plan. Otherwise, it's not going to work. So it's not really, maybe it's a false dichotomy to say it's either full centralization or full decentralization. That's maybe a false dichotomy.
I was about to say, as a former anarchist, sometimes I feel like anarchists don't realize that within Marxism, there is room for these very democratic structures, like especially within, like, workers' councils. Like I feel like anarchists, like they don't really realize that, and they kind of view the concept of centralization as very authoritarian or as like sort of a dictatorship.
Yeah, a lot of people, they maybe see, and this is also like many Marxists, they maybe see a Marxist state or socialism as something very rigid and kind of set in stone. They don't realize that in certain conditions, socialism is going to look one way, but then when conditions change, it should also change accordingly. And that's also maybe the problem with the Soviet Union, is that when the situation in Russia escalated, they had the revolution and civil war and foreign invasions and all this, and they just kept centralizing everything more and more and having more and more discipline. But then when the situation got better and it came time to sort of relax a little bit, they couldn't implement that. But the anarchist solution of just never having the discipline and the centralization to begin with, that would have just resulted in them losing and being defeated right away. So that's not really a solution either. So it's more of you kind of have to constantly just think, okay, is this the right thing to do, and should we are we still in touch with the masses and everything? There's no real like simple blueprint, like, okay, yeah, this model works for all time all time and all places. No, you kind of always have to adjust it a little bit.
I think a lot of people, a lot of people, especially on the left wing, like they have a desire to change things, but they find it hard to like get involved with stuff. So like if you are speaking to someone that felt a bit like that, who was left wing but felt alienated and disempowered, what would you say to them? Like what advice would you give them about how to get involved and make some change?
Well, I'm optimistic in the sense that I think that capitalism doesn't have a future, so socialism is going to win. But I'm also pessimistic in the sense that I don't expect any quick, huge changes, like, oh yeah, we just demonstrate a little bit and then we're going to achieve something massive. I don't think so. It's going to be, we're in this for the long game, basically. So I think people need to be organized. What type of organization that is, it depends on your situation. If you're studying, you should be in student organizing. If you have a job, then you should be unionized. You should try to get in touch with the Marxist Party. If there isn't one, then try to find some other people who are Marxists and talk to them. Sorry, what was the question?
Just advice. It was like advice you would give someone that was that wanted to get involved. Like, where do you think the focus should be for people that want to make a change? Like, what kind of things do you think that we should be doing?
Well, there's several different things. There's being involved in a party, that's one thing. And another thing is being involved in so-called mass organizations. So whether it be like peace movement, women's movement, climate, like the environmental movement, whatever it is, you kind of need both, in my opinion. You need to have a Marxist understanding and have a Marxist party, but you also need to be in mass movements. But I can't promise that it's gonna give you any immediate personal material advantages. Quite the opposite. It's probably gonna be just work and more work, but that's the nature of things.
Hey, speaking of like, getting people into Marxism, if you had to like, recommend one or two texts to immediately introduce all the concepts of Marxism, which text would you recommend for anyone looking to like research deeper into it?
Man, that's actually a tough one. I mean, the Communist Manifesto is obviously a good one to start with because it's it's probably the biggest classic there is. There probably is some like great introduction to Marxism, but I've always just kind of read the source material itself, like writings of Marx. And well, maybe I would say Communist Manifesto and then check out like the more well-known books by Lenin. So What is to be Done, State and Revolution, Imperialism, those are pretty good ones. First time when you read them, you might not understand a lot of it. It can be tough, but that's kind of how it is.
Which
Okay.
I was just going to say, which book had the most impact on you personally?
It might be Foundations of Leninism by Stalin, because that's it's a pretty simple book to get into. It it describes different aspects of Leninism, what it involves, and Lenin's position on some important topics. So maybe that one, but even that, unfortunately, it kind of assumes that you already know some stuff.
I was about to say, I feel State and Rev is really good because, especially when getting into communism or like Marxism and stuff, there's a tendency to drift towards anarchist thinking. So I kind of feel like, something like State and Rev is very good for getting people away from that kind of thought.
Yeah, that's true. Engels has this famous little essay called On Authority. That's also something that people always recommend to anarchists. But even State and Revolution, like what I find about a lot of these books is that when I've read some of them again, I've seen like, wow, this is actually a lot more deep than I first realized. There's a lot more there. So when I first read some of those books, yeah, I got some of it. But when I read them again, it was like a whole new world. I was like, wow, I didn't realize that this was like, it had all these things in it as well.
What's your like? Were your parents communist? Did you grow up communist, or did you come to it later in life?
My parents were not communist. I kind of just stumbled into it, I would say. started out as I guess a liberal, even though in this country we don't have a liberal party. We we have a social democrat party, and I eventually became a social democrat. Um, I thought that the workers deserve better conditions, and since they're the ones who actually do everything, they should get to decide what happens to the fruits of their labor. And eventually, I found Richard Wolff, who is like a pretty popular Marxist economist. He's like a popularizer of Marxist economics. So I stumbled upon him, and then when I finally looked more into the history of communism, that's how I started reading Lenin and stuff and became a Marxist Leninist.
Speaking of like, Lenin, like a very popular Leninist tradition here in the UK is Trotskyism. It's probably like, how would you I know you're very much against like Trotskyism, like how would you go about combating Trotskyism? What kind of arguments would you have against it overall?
Well, the problem with Trotskyism is that once again, there's so many different kinds of Trotskyism. That's why it's almost not even a real ideology to me, because they don't really agree on anything amongst themselves besides that they like Trotsky and they don't like the Soviet Union. And that's maybe the whole problem of it. It's not really a movement, it's kind of just an anti-movement or an opposition movement. And that's why it's kind of parasitic on not only communism in the sense that it was created as an opposition to the communist movement, but also that it's parasitic on anti-communism, because the stronger anti-communism is, the stronger Trotskyism is, because Trotskyism is seen as the sort of the communists who are against communism. So people say, oh, the Soviet Union was evil, so therefore, if you want to be a Marxist, you need to become a Trotskyist. So and that's really, I guess, the whole problem of it. It's based on criticizing and attacking historical socialism, which I think is counterproductive. And I also don't agree with Trotsky's theories. And to be quite honest, I don't think many people come to Trotskyism because they think Trotsky's theories are so compelling or something. They come to Trotskyism because they don't like the Soviet Union, and people tell them that the Soviet Union was bad, so they feel like they have to become Trotskyists. And you can tell because many Trotskyists, they start by reading Trotsky's autobiography instead of any theoretical books. And because they can't agree amongst themselves what Trotsky's theories even are.
I mean, I was about to say, you see it a lot with, speaking of Trotskyism being the anti-communist movement, you see with a lot of, you see with a lot of, Trotskyists and stuff, that they become like neoconservatives in the future. Like you saw it a lot,
Yeah.
like back, like when like 9/11 happened, you saw a lot of former Trotskyists become actual full-blown conservatives. Would you say that's an inherent like problem due to like problems with the theory, or?
Well, it's the tragedy of Trotskyism, and it's twofold. Not only has the capitalist class has always tried to prop up Trotskyism and support Trotskyism against the standard, Marxist-Leninist type of communism for obvious reasons. It was the anti-Soviet movement, so they supported it. And so ideologically, people who were Trotskyists, they might have thought that they have to work with anybody who is against the Soviet Union or who is against communism. So they sometimes collaborated with right wingers, and sometimes became right wingers. Like Christopher Hitchens was one, and you have these people who are like pseudo Trotskyists, like Orwell, who Orwell thought that he was a socialist, but he also worked with the British and American secret services against the Soviet Union and all this stuff. But it also works the other way around. the capitalists and capitalist secret services often use Trotskyism as a cover for themselves because it's pretty convenient. If you are a CIA agent, what's a better cover for your anti-communist stuff inside the workers' movement than just claim you're a Trotskyist, and that's perfect cover.
Well, I think it's been an hour. Do you have any other questions, Aaron, to finish with?
I don't really have any other questions and stuff, but honestly, Finbol, it's been super good having you. Yeah, it's been brilliant.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I mean, it's such a Marxism is such a massive topic that we could I could be talking about this like all day. Obviously, it just goes on and on. But yeah, it was nice.
We could do this again sometime.
Oh yeah, sure.
I was about to say, as it's been now, thank you for coming on, and have a good one.
Yep, thanks.